Sorry. Continue.
Experience got me thinking about how complex the whole development process is, and that while citizen-led development is a great idea, it would be awesome to have the right professional experience on board, both to help organise the group and also to create legal structures and then to get through the design, development and building process smoothly. My mum, Anne Thompson, is also very interested in co-housing, and she pointed me to the Property Collective's website. I contacted Tim and he suggested he could run an information session about the work property collectives have been doing in Melbourne and the potential it might have to assist citizen-led development in Canberra. So here we are. I'm really looking forward to hearing more, and I'd like to welcome Tim Riley and Andy Fergus.
Thanks, Paul. We're excited about taking you guys through, I suppose, what we've been doing in Melbourne. First of all, I hope people don't mind if I record the session. Please let me know if you do. But I thought it'd be good to record it so that we can share the link with people who haven't been able to turn up tonight. Because invariably, some people that registered don't end up turning up. Also, I've asked Thor to try and moderate as well as we go through the session. So if you do have chats, you have questions or comments that you want to add through the chat, please do that, and we'll try and cover them in the presentation. I'd really like to make this as interactive a session as possible. So please feel free to interject and ask questions as they pop up, rather than necessarily holding them off till the end. We've sort of set to 7 o'clock for this session. I think the presentation component should take around about 45 minutes. So there should be plenty of time for questions at the end. But like I said, please feel free to just put your hand up or ask a question as we go along. So we might just get into it then, I think. I'll introduce Andy as we go as well, and we can talk a bit more about our roles in all of this. So yeah, this presentation really is all about the Property Collectives model that we've been evolving and refining over the last 10 years in Melbourne. And at its core, it's a citizen-led housing model, and its aim is to build homes at cost. This picture is the first project that we did from 2010 to 2013. And 3 of the 4 participants in that project are in this photo. And really the start of Property Collectives, from my perspective, was a very personal one, in that I wanted to be in the north of Melbourne. I had a certain sort of budget, and looking around the market, there was nothing I thought was worth me spending the money on. And my friend Dan, who's carrying his daughter in the black jumper, he's an architect at a practice called 6 Degrees in Melbourne. And we thought at the time it was a good idea for us to get together and try and do it ourselves. So we built 4 townhouses on this block that we purchased using the same model. And since then, we've gone on to create a number of collectives using this same model throughout Melbourne. So in terms of Property Collectives is 2 things really. It's a team of collaborators that are providing development management and strategic advisory, and really this has evolved over the last 3 or 4 years, I suppose. It sort of started with me, and then John Lim in the bottom right-hand corner joined about three years ago, and then Tim Richardson joined about 18 months ago. Chris Adams, Andy Fergus. I've known Andy for quite a while now, Andy, a number of years. We've been, Andy's a really alternative development model enthusiast, and has been great at supporting me and property collectives in our model. He's taught me a lot, and now we're starting to work together on a number of different projects. So the property collectives team is really a bit of a collaborative network of like-minded property professionals, each with their own specific specialisation. And
it's not very good.
It's just cutting out a little bit, Tim, your voice. I'm not sure if that's the same for everyone else.
Sorry. I'll just ask everybody to mute if they can, because I was just getting a bit of feedback there too. Is that okay? Is that a bit better? Hopefully it is. Everybody has their own speciality. And Andy, I don't know whether you want to just talk a bit about your particular bent, but Andy's very much focused on urban design and architectural elements.
Yeah, so my presentation a little bit later will probably explain that quite clearly, but I've been very interested since about 2010 when I first went to a lecture by Jeffrey London on sort of alternative development model research in Germany, and subsequently went and visited sort of 2 or 3 different times a number of Baugruppe and also Baugemeinschaft and various other models in Germany to learn a lot about what was being done over there. And as an architect and urban designer, it became very clear to me that the answer was not design, the answer was finance, and that the preconditions that enabled these fantastic projects and people to design their own communities was all about who was investing and what was motivating them. So the big investors motivated by a short-term windfall gain, and they're not going to build great places for communities, are they? So I think that became a real passion of mine. I worked quite closely with Nightingale Housing for a number of years, less so in recent times, but I was heavily involved in some of the in Nightingale 1 and some of those projects, and I'm also doing a bit of work with an Assemble. So I've sort of been involved in various ways with a number of sort of alternative development models which are quite divergent, and happy to sort of later on answer questions. And people are like, well, what's this? You know, Tim's model is quite specific. It's essentially the only model at the moment that is entirely a kind of syndicate model where people fund their own home, whereas the other models are sort of ethical and sustainable, but still very much delivered through a more traditional off the plan project type where it's there's obviously a profit sort of element and less sort of design involvement. So happy to sort of answer some questions about that later. But yeah, I share the love of the German Baugruppe, Thor. So, and with your German last name, I'm wondering who you also visited some over the years.
Oh, no, I haven't actually. Just read some articles about it.
Yeah, right. Happy to do. I mean, tonight I've got a really pithy little run through of a couple of projects, but if you're interested another time, happy to go through a much longer one for the nuts and bolts of a few kind of great projects from Germany as well. But I'll pass back to Tim.
So talking about Baugruppe or building group, this slide really talks about how the model works at a really, really high level, obviously. And the main difference is really to the sort of traditional speculative model is that we work really hard, I suppose, at the start of a project, even before a piece of land is identified, to identify and bring together a group of like-minded people who want to pool their financial resources and buy the land together to fund their own development. So we're creating the community before we've even purchased the land, which is a key difference to the normal model where, a developer buys the land and then works out what they think the community wants, designs it, delivers it, and then, people buy it either off the plan or as it's completed. So bringing together people at the start of the process means that, the objectives of that group or that collective get prioritised, and they get to control the process through that development program. After we've bought a piece of land, step 2 is the collective refining their specific needs and like I said, controlling and designing the build of their project. At the completion of that process, everybody receives a home that's customised to their needs at cost, and that's typically around 15% less than the market. And we'll go through a couple of case studies, projects that we've finished as part of this presentation. And using this model, we've put together 9 collectives, building 60 homes in Melbourne since 2010, so over the last 10 years. So by enabling like-minded people to effectively boost their buying power, we're able to deliver better homes more affordably. And we do it more affordably because the group is becoming the developer, and they're internalising that developer margin, and they're pocketing that as a saving, because the total cost that they're paying is just the cost. There's no additional margin or profit margin that they're seeking on top of that. They're just bearing the cost. So we internalise the developer margins, and our role is really to facilitate that process and act as almost we're the development managers, but we're acting almost as the developer on the group's behalf. Additional savings are that there's no agent or marketing fees or sales commissions that the projects need to bear, so that cost is not passed through to the participants. That's a direct saving. And the structure is also very efficient. If the group is set up properly before the land is acquired, then at the end of that process, if you go back to that last slide, that's step 3, where all the homes, the titles are created, that stage of the process doesn't trigger a capital gains tax event, it doesn't trigger a stamp duty event, and there's no GST transfer at that point.
This is a really important point. I think a lot of people who are excited and have the money and even have architects, etc., and ready to go can jump and buy a property. If they don't get the legal structure right to begin with, it can have quite significant costs on the overall project. So that structure before you acquire land is so important, isn't it, Tim?
Yeah, it is. It is. And look, it doesn't mean that if the structure is not, if everybody in the group is not absolutely on board before you settle the land, that's disastrous. It just has some tax impacts, that the project then would need to bear additionally. It's just the most efficient if it's all set up right at the start. The other thing I suppose that's very different about this model is that it's a participatory process, and the fact that the members of each collective have more control over the location, design, and the quality of their future homes is a really important motivator, I think, for most of our participants. Obviously, the fact that it's at cost and is more affordable is a really powerful motivator, but I think that ability to control the design outcome and the quality of the build is also a really powerful motivator for all of the people that join.
Being empowered to make your own trade-offs rather than someone else making them for you in a development process.
Yeah, that's right. So yes, it is a very participatory process, right from, you know, purchasing the land, what sort of land, what sort of site is going to suit the group, right through to setting the objectives, that design process through to tendering, builder selection, and even the funder. You know, the members of the collective all have an equal say in how those decisions are made through the process. So this slide just talks to that process at a higher level. The participants in each joint venture, and I'll go into the actual structure in a second, they each own an interest in the property, which gives them beneficial ownership of the land, and it gives them a vote on the management committee. And that's really important because that's how each member maintains control over the project. So decisions are made via majority and special majority. And we leverage the Royal Institute of British Architects, or RIBA, plan of work methodology to govern the design and development process. And that construct has a series of endorsement gates that enables participatory decision making, but it also allows the development management team enough flexibility and control to, you know, deliver the project effectively and efficiently without having to come back to the group and get, you know, approval on every single decision, you know. So the table there on the right just talks about the key gates from gate 0, acquiring a piece of land, right through to gate 7, which is, you know, operating the completed homes. And, you know, what that endorsement is at each of those gates, from setting the objectives right at the start to gate 6, which is, you know, commencing construction.
Hey, Tim.
Yep.
I've been reading, you know, you read some projects where the participants have tried to run the whole thing themselves and it's turned into an absolute epic. Like all the decision making and all the, it almost seems when you read about it that they've had to learn how to be developers and builders and kind of planners and everything themselves. And it's, to me, that's kind of off-putting because I know I haven't got the time for that.
Yeah.
So for me, this looks like a good model.
I think the other thing, though, is that a lot of the successful examples overseas that are heavily documented, it might not be evident initially, but they often have active government facilitation. So whether it's in Belgium or Copenhagen, you'll often have, you know, favourable settlement conditions, active planning support, architectural input from the local council. In Australia, we don't have that. So it's important to have the right team to support.
Yeah, and look, we've been going for 10 years now, and we've, you know, finished 3 projects. We have the 9 projects. We've arrived at this approach through a bit of trial and error, Thor, you know, because at the start it was, you know, me and my mate trying to build 4 townhouses, and, you know, learning all those development, you know, you've got the social, you know, decision making processes as one part, but yeah, it was about us just learning the trade as well. And I think what this construct does is strike that right balance. And I think we've sort of got to a point where we understand what sort of decisions are really important for people, and you know, how to give people enough information to make those decisions efficiently, versus you know, getting embroiled in, the minutiae of every single decision on a project. So, like anything, it's a bit of a balancing act, but
it's part of the beauty, Tim, of this, as you've developed up this process, the gateways shown here, is to be comfortable in stage 1B, that you don't have to worry about taps yet. So you're going to get to talk about these things later, but you know what you should be focusing on at each stage, and have clarity that you're not going to miss your opportunity to have a say on something important. I think that structure is so important.
Yeah, absolutely. So look, this slide is a bit of a diagram which shows the typical joint venture model that we're running at the moment. So if I take you through this slide step by step, on the right-hand side here, we have sort of broadly 3 phases, the acquisition or land purchase funding stage, and then just below it, the design and build construction loan phase. And then the final phase is partition or takeout finance stage. And that really is completion. And the key legal entities that are involved are the boxes in black. So for every project, we set up a special purpose vehicle land company, proprietary limited, and it acts as the manager of a special purpose vehicle joint venture. So the structure is a joint venture structure from a legal perspective. It's not a unit trust or a family trust or anything like that. It's a joint venture, which is a tax partnership. And I suppose the main difference between like a unit trust and a joint venture is that in a unit trust, which is much more common structure that most people are probably familiar with, the control sits with the corporate trustee, right, that administers the unit trust. A joint venture flips that. The control sits in the joint venture, and the control sits with the management committee. And I suppose one of the key aspects to this model, which I suppose has a flavour of a co-op, although it's not officially a co-op, is that it's 1 vote per joint venturer. So there's 1 vote per member.
Tim, is one of the other issues in terms of liability. If it was a unit trust, you'd have a more limited liability, whereas I think with this, it's a fairly unlimited liability.
Hey, Caroline. Good curly question, on in the presentation. No. With the joint venture structure, there is limited liability in the actual joint venture itself. It enshrines a proportional liability according to your interest, right? So if your interest was 10%, then your ultimate liability would only be 10%. But what happens, and I'm happy to talk about it a bit more when we get into the finance, is that when you go for construction funding and you're dealing with the banks, most banks will want joint and several liability. That it's not, several liability is proportional to your interest or your share. Joint liability is a full liability for all of the debt facility. And what the bank will do is it will ask, if it's offering joint and several liability, it will ask all of the members to provide, to almost waive what they've committed to each other under the joint venture in the eyes of the bank for that debt, right? It doesn't mean that the joint ventures don't ultimately have limited liability according to their interest. It just means that they've waived that in the eyes of the bank. So in a circumstance where the bank had to pursue the joint venturers for some reason, the joint venturers would still be able to have recourse to have limited liability, if that makes sense. Yeah, but that's a really important point that you've touched on, Caroline, and I will talk a bit more about that in the finance, because that is the risk with this model. And that's why the model is not necessarily for everybody, because you are becoming the developer. The reason why you're able to obtain your homes at cost is because you've taken on that risk of being the developer, and your reward is getting those dwellings at cost. And it comes at a higher risk. If you want no risk, then the best thing to do is buy a property that's already built under the normal paradigm, or the next thing back from that is buy off the plan from a really, really reputable developer, right, where there is no risk. That risk sits with the developer. So this is the trade-off, and it comes back to who is controlling the money. If you want more control over the built form outcome, you need to come up with that developer equity capital, and you need to accept that risk. So that's the trade-off that people need to work through in their minds. Yeah.
Tim, just sort of thinking that your knowledge of the other people in the group, and they're checking that everyone is on the same page and has the same is in the right financial situation, is going to be your reduction of your risk in a way.
Yep.
So that's where you assess your risk, and I guess if you get a good group together, then the risk is actually lower.
That's absolutely correct, and again, I'll talk about that in a bit more detail when we get through the finance section of the presentation. But a big part of what we do is manage a finance assessment process with everybody who's interested in becoming a participant. And a lot of the times, the outcome of that finance assessment will be that certain participants may not be in a position to participate, and we have to have that conversation with people, because we sort of play this funny role where we are the guardians of the collective. Even though we're not necessarily a member of the collective, it's clearly in our interest to make sure that that collective is set up for success from the start. And so somebody needs to make a call around whether, if somebody is borderline, in terms of their participation, whether or not they should be allowed to participate or not, So yeah, that's a really, really critical part of the process, which happens even before you've purchased a piece of land, Yeah. So in terms of the rest of this slide, you have the SPV Land Co and SPV joint venture. They are the key entities on which everything is based, and all the individual joint venturers, and you can see them there, sort of 1 to 9 in this example. They are the beneficial owners of the land right from the start, and they underwrite the project. They guarantee the project's success. Off to the side, we have in the grey box a special purpose vehicle development company, and we use that development company to do a couple of things. But basically to contract with the builder, and also to obtain the development funding for the joint venture. And we do that because in our experience, most banks will want this structure to look as typical to a normal development structure as possible. and the bank will want people. Once we get to build, the bank will want people in control of the development who have the character, the capability, and the capacity to complete the project. The bank doesn't want at that point to have the risk of decision making being slow decision making, I suppose, for want of a better term. It just wants people with experience in the driver's seat to make sure that the build goes as smoothly as possible. So this development code allows that to happen, and it's providing a pretty essential service of providing the bank with confidence that the building is going to be delivered efficiently. So we're using this structure on effectively all of our current projects, some with slight differences, but the core structure is what we're using on all of these different projects. You can see there's 9 projects at the moment. The ones in grey are the ones that we've finished. The ones in white are in various different stages of the development cycle. But all of the projects to date have been between 6 to 10 dwellings, and they've all been sort of, around 4 to 7 k's from the city. So the next few slides are just taking you very quickly through some of the projects that we've finished. So this is the first one in St George's Road in Northcote. It's 4 townhouses. We built them between 2010 to 2013. When they finished, each townhouse cost around 630,000, and we got some different valuations when they came back because there were different valuers coming in and assessing them. But on average, they came in at about 735,000 in terms of that end value.
So incredible compared to what they're worth now, Tim, the one that was recently on the market. Yeah, there you go.
In March, one of the dwellings sold for 1.1. The second project we finished is also in Northcote in Clark Street. It's 7 townhouses, and we built these between 2014 to 2018. And these were larger, and we also paid more for the land. So the cost was significantly higher than the first project. It was nearly $1,050,000 per dwelling. But the values on completion came in at nearly 1.2, sort of around that 1.15, 1.2 mark. Third project we finished, 6 townhouses in Thornbury. That went from 2015 to 2019. And the numbers on that project were very similar to the Clark Street project. So the next section, talking a bit about collective formation, and most of the slides really talk about avenue number 1, which is collective formation prior to the land acquisition. So that's where we get most of the collective together before we buy the land. But the other way to form a collective is to do the land acquisition prior to collective formation. Now, we've not done that yet. We have had conversations on a number of occasions with landowners who are interested in doing a project along these lines and building up a community around their piece of land. And we're also starting to look at how we can secure land on long settlement terms to allow us to build up the community and take advantage of long settlement terms. So both are possible. I feel like the second option is probably a bit harder, to be honest. I mean, obviously, because we haven't actually executed one using that strategy. But it is probably it's probably the avenue which is more common in Europe, albeit in Europe, you know, this sort of model, this sort of bower group and or building group approach has been around for much longer, so it's a bit more established than obviously what it is here. So, in terms of collective creation, where the group does not have a site yet, our typical process is, before we go looking for a site, is that we make sure that we have a core collective of around a third to a half of the future joint venturers on board. Now, we choose that sort of number because we know that that is enough capacity to secure a site once it comes up. And that's the approach we've taken on all of our projects. We've never sort of purchased a site with the full complement of participants on board. So it's these joint venturers who come on board at the start who are very critical, clearly. They shape the project and they define what that project's going to be about. And like I said, after a site is acquired, we quite quickly find the balance of participants from our network. And that's where getting a longer settlement term is really critical in the acquisition strategy. We always try for 6 months. I mean, it's great to get more than that, but we find that 6 months is what, I suppose, not necessarily our minimum, but that's what we're always looking for. I think the fastest we've done is 4 months. So if I go down to the sort of the graphics on this slide, really collectives occur in my experience because we have either individuals or groups who are interested in getting into a certain location, but have a set budget. And a lot of the collectives are forming because of a shared interest around living in a certain location. That seems to be one of the really key things for me, what I've seen. And we also have owner-occupiers and long-term investors in our current projects. So we're not, we don't discriminate against investors because in our experience, it takes both to enable a project like this. But with the investors, we make sure that their objectives around the quality of what we're trying to do are aligned. And we always make sure that those investors' intention is to hold the home or the asset for the long term. We really don't want investors involved in our projects that have a sort of a short-term flipped kind of mentality, because you know, the values are not going to be aligned, I think, with owner-occupiers through the process. So those yellow circles really summarising, I suppose, that first step around meeting and greeting, doing a finance assessment, like I mentioned previously, and then going through a process of sharing the legals, so people get their heads around how the legals work. And then we have a thing called a participation agreement, which we ask people to sign, and that sort of formalises you know, a person's intention. And then once we get that core collective of around about a third to a half of the joint venturers, we then have created the next collective, and then move on in earnest to that site acquisition. And like I said, it is the vision of the people who commit early in the process who will shape the project. We also reward people with a higher pick of the units the earlier they join the project, because at that stage when you're forming a collective, it's I think you know, earlier commitment it should be rewarded in some respect, because the next collective is really not going to start until people commit.
Tim, just a question there. There's two questions there. One from Julie that might be an end of presentation question, and then one from Cal that relates to just what you were talking there about potential investors as part of the project.
So this slide talks a bit about a process that we've just run on a couple of projects, and I'll just through all the animation. So we ran this process this year for a project in Belfield and also a project in Byron Bay, where in Byron Bay we had no site. In Belfield there was a site that council was selling, and the first step was running an expression of interest survey, and really getting a sense of, you know, who's interested in participating and what their specific objectives are, what their wants are, but also what their situation is from a finance perspective. From that, you know, we ended up with a number of people who were keen to join a group, and joining at that early stage really is about committing to a process, because we haven't really got to acquiring a piece of land yet. It's about going through that process and committing to that process. 2A is about setting a project brief. So we take that data and we take the outputs of all the conversations that we've had to inform a project brief. And 2B is about doing a finance assessment. So we work with a couple of different debt advisors, and we do a quite detailed finance assessment, which is an opportunity for us as the development managers, but also the individuals to have an independent assessment of where they're at from a finance perspective. 2C is about sharing the legals and the participation agreement. And 2D is a joining fee. So if we are going to move into the acquisition phase, that project does need some funds to pay for an architect, to pay for a town planner, to pay for the DM. Really, there needs to be an acquisition budget set, so that acquisition phase, the due diligence, can be done properly. So the joining fee is all about just having some funds to cover those acquisition costs. Step 3 was about taking all those things from the project brief and the finance assessment and doing a feasibility study on a piece of land that has sold recently, and looking at a scheme that aligns to the members of the collective into their objectives and what they want, right? And then after that feasibility study, we feed it back into an acquisition brief, because I think a lot of the challenges that I've seen, particularly with co-housing groups, is the tendency is to leap straight to finding a property, right? But without doing the work to understand that finance strategy, and without doing the work to get really, really quite granular on objectives, there's no, it's not, the property strategy may change, if that makes sense, through doing that work. So the property strategy kind of has to adjust to the circumstances of the group and the capacity of the group. So it's kind of no use leaping straight into property strategy. So this is the process we use to refine what that property strategy should be and what that acquisition brief needs to be, so that the group can support, you know, that purchase and have confidence in supporting that purchase. So that's step 4, acquisition brief. Like I said, it's an update of that project brief in 2A, but it's got that added layer of finance information, and in step 3, the feasibility study around what that group can afford. And really only after we've gone through those steps, we then go on to get to gate 0, which is site acquisition. So it seems, I suppose, maybe a bit exhausting, and in some respects it can be. But it's really, really critical, because without going through these steps, you're not really setting up the project for success.
Hey, Tim, there's a question from Ruth Brunner about how the costs of the property collectives, fees and services covered.
Yep. Well, really simply, we charge a development management fee. So when we do the feasibility study for any purchase, our fee will be a line item in the professional fees, just like an architect or a town planner or a structural or civil engineer. We work out our fee on a percentage of the gross realised value of the project. In Melbourne, it's typically between sort of 3 to 3.5%, depending on the value of the project. And then we convert that into a fixed fee, and we just draw down on it as the project progresses. So that's how our fees work.
And just, I guess, it sounds like we've got a few people who are in the industry already here, but I guess that development management fee is normally borne in kind of 2 ways, either outsourced to a professional consultancy who provides that services anyway, or for larger developers, it'll be internalised in a service that they would offer as part of their project. But they're only, you know, highly capitalised large developers that sort of, you know, would typically have that service. So it's not like it's a completely different service. It's just the same services of development without the developer, essentially, would be a good way to think of it.
So the next couple of slides are about finance, and we have already touched on that already, but there's probably 4 stages here. So the first one, stage 0, is the finance assessment, and I've talked about that a bit already. Through the process, there'll be 3 loans. The first loan is the land purchase finance. The second loan is the development finance. And the third loan is takeout finance, or the home loans that individuals will get secured against their dwelling on completion. And this first point about controlling funding, we've already touched on, but really controlling the funding is the key to this model. And as Andy said earlier as well, it allows collectives to control the built form and outcome and receive their homes at cost. Now, the members share the total development cost proportionally. And based on the funding that we're getting at the moment, the equity contributions from participants will need to be about 30% of the total development cost over the 3.5-year project duration. The rest we will borrow in debt. So for land purchase, we typically get a loan of about 50 to 70% LVR at about 3 to 5% interest. It's usually a commercial facility. And to Caroline's point, previously, the individual JVs are usually joint and severally liable for that debt on land. So once again, what that means is that if for example, that first loan is a $1.5 million loan and we have 15 participants, even though each participant would only be proportionally responsible for $100,000 of that $1.5 million loan, in the eyes of the bank, all 15 will be liable for the full $1.5 million. So that's what joint and several liability means. During construction, we obtain a construction loan for around 70 to 75% of LCR, loan to cost ratio. So it's about 70 to 75% of the development costs, exclusive of GST. Interest rates around 4 to 5%. And at this stage, liability can be joint and several or several. It depends on the bank that we end up going with. So obviously at that point, a several liability is more attractive for people, but not all banks offer it. And then on completion, we get to take out finance. So at that sort of gearing level for bank loan number 2, on completion, the home loans tend to be around 55% of the value of the completed dwellings. It's quite low gearing at the start, but that's obviously because each participant has put in about 30% of the total costs, and then you're benefiting from that equity uplift of the extra value in the dwelling on completion. And this slide is a bit busy, but I always get asked this question. This slide is trying to illustrate over that project duration, when is the money due? So across the top, you can see the different stages from collective creation to land acquisition, planning permit, build permit and finance and build. I put an estimate of how much time that will take. So the whole process can be between 42 to 55 months, depending on where within those bands we end up. And then that section which talks about equity capital contributions, there's probably around 7 contributions over that project life cycle. At those different points that I've got listed, and I won't go through them all. But broadly, for the land purchase and for the land acquisition, it's usually about 1/3 of the contribution comes in to secure the land. Then by the time we've got our planning permit and we're ready to start building, another 1/3 goes in. At the start of construction, the final 1/3 goes in. That's broadly been what our experience is on most projects. And the section right at the bottom just gives you an indication of what the actual contributions have been for a project where we've got a case study for at the end of this presentation. So the next section is Andy's, and Andy's going to give us a bit of a global context and a local context around this type of development model.
Thanks. It does sound, as I said, like a few people are in the industry. Obviously, we know Thor is, and I'm guessing maybe Julie is also a planner or architect or something. So apologies if this is a bit repetitive for some people. But so essentially, as I mentioned, that's not for me. Essentially, I've had the opportunity through both teaching and personal research and personal interest to visit a number of different models around Europe. Actually, that's extended to North America in recent years, and Japan as well, where there's particular hotspots of cooperative housing and other types of models as well, but have been mostly focused on this sort of region. And sort of, I guess I started with the Bell Grouper movement, and then became very clear to me that a lot of models were riffing off each other from adjacent countries, and there was a lot of exchange that was starting to occur. I'm particularly interested in the global financial crisis in 2008. A lot of these models that had been perhaps more peripheral models, or often more concentrated in rural or second or third tier cities, all of a sudden burst onto the stage in major cities, like in the harbour of Amsterdam. In central Berlin, you saw a massive sort of increase in the uptake of a lot of these models, and a lot of architectural innovation and spatial innovation that came out of that. Tim, I just realised I can't click. Sorry, I'm clicking my Zoom screen, which is probably not very useful. So it's just, I thought it'd be good just to talk in kind of categories or spectrums to explain sort of different approaches. And so I guess the three sort of examples I guess you see more traditionally are sort of a townhouse, or I guess a Torrens title. I don't know if that applies in a kind of Crown land lease scenario such as Canberra, but a two-dimensional subdivision without a body corporate or an S corporation, a fairly straightforward arrangement. Then a number of hybrids, of course, where people are combining townhouses with, in this case, townhouses that have multiple occupancy within the same building volume. And then the sort of apartment typology. Obviously, you're familiar with the differences with these, but they have, of course, huge implications for construction cost, building efficiency, and threshold scales. For example, a very low-rise, small apartment building can be very expensive compared to a townhouse, and the efficiencies with an apartment might come at a slightly larger scale if you're committing to a certain sort of construction approach. So you go to the next one. And then the other thing is that I guess this spectrum, as Thor sort of alluded to, of how much do you want to do yourself. So from the projects I visited, there's really everything from, purely self-initiated, self-built, registering as master builders and building the project yourself, or whatever that might be, all the way through to full professional facilitation. So on the left, there's a small samenbouwen is what they call it in the Netherlands, or a CPO is the other word for it. And there's 3 townhouses there on the left that were built together by a group, self-initiated. They bought 3 plots together and then sort of built their development collectively. In the middle, you've got a project where a series of architects and artists built a project together, but then also brought in other people later on. So the architects were able to shape the project with that preliminary community, perhaps also about a third, like as Tim was mentioning, and then others bought into the plan that was already sort of pre-designed. So that one's Oderberger Strasse in Berlin. And then on the right, we've got the Houthavens precinct in Amsterdam, which is extraordinary because essentially the whole area was carved up for developers to build, what they normally do, and they had to rip up all the contracts because all the developers went bankrupt in the global financial crisis. So they released these plots to a series of groups to build on. But essentially these projects, the architects again designed a system that was complete, and then people chose their apartments within that system and were able to have sort of flexibility within it. And that particular model is called the super lofts model. So you see a real difference from sort of, just getting an apartment at cost and co-funding it and just moving in versus perhaps on the left, the more, make every single decision along the way yourself. So if you keep going, there's a couple of case studies I thought would be kind of interesting just to talk about.
Andy, just had a comment. Do you mind holding your mic just a bit closer to your... Yeah.
Sorry. Yep. Did you miss all of that, or did you hear?
Fine, it's just a little bit distorted.
Sure. Yep. And so this project here in Delft in the Netherlands is a really interesting one. This is my partner Kath and our friend Birgit, who lives in this house. And what's quite extraordinary about this neighbourhood is that essentially each plot was carved off and given to individual self-builders. So each person builds a townhouse. They generally worked in pairs or triples of contractors. For reasons in the Netherlands to do with slab construction, but essentially each house is very much bespoke. So of course that has a cost implication to do with the level of customization, the loss of economies of scale, etc. But they had very cheap access to land. They were able to divide the site very densely into this sort of townhouse style development. So they built a street boundary on one side and then share this kind of inner courtyard. And they were able to make rules together about, what could be built in a backyard and how might the facades look, etc. But what was kind of extraordinary about this project is that the community didn't have to act together. They were sort of allocated plots and then built, but of course they all met through the process of the building as well as the designing. And so when visiting Birgit's house, you can see the view here of the backyard in the middle. They actually decided just not to put the fences up. So rather than an architect deciding, oh yes, you'll all live communally and without fences, everyone had fences on their approved drawings, but over time actually found it there were more subtle ways that they could define their own personal property. And even on the left, I love the image here of the trampoline. You might notice it's actually shared between two properties. So they made a decision later on in the process actually to combine their backyards because their kids could have a much larger space than if they just had one. So something very interesting about this project around the initial design and how it evolved through that process of sort of being together, but of course highly customized with cost implications. So if we go to the next one, this is another one that I just mentioned before. You can see that same project on the left, but this is a whole neighbourhood where, again, the plots were released, but they were street oriented. So rather than a courtyard, each one could sort of build along this kind of street. And again, you have this opportunity for people to make decisions through the process of sharing gardens and not having fences between one another. And they actually chose, because their street was good for solar orientation, so in our case it would be a north-facing street, they were obliged to have these very deep gardens, and so they were able to have this incredible continuous landscape space. They put all of their mailboxes together on one street and had a shared shade structure, so you could see how that became kind of more communal over time. But one interesting thing about this project is these individual plots, which were not sort of intended to be body corporate or vertical division, they were meant to be townhouses. Some groups did decide to build together vertically, so you have a blend within this project of some townhouses that are completely vertical, and then you have some, so say these are sort of vertical, and you can see these ones here are stacked horizontally. So it's quite a sort of quite a lot of difference within that model that was sort of enabled within it. If we go to the next one. This is a model that's a little bit more efficient, perhaps. So there's a series of houses in Rotterdam in this Huisrecht project where one architect designed it with each of the members. All the members were brought together at the time of construction and made decisions together, but they chose 2 brick products, 1 front door material, and 1 or 2 different window materials. And so while they achieved this diversity along the street frontage that creates that sense of a neighbourhood built over time, they achieved the construction efficiencies of limiting the number, the material palette and the number of options within the project. So this one starts to dial up the efficiency a little bit, but there's still that townhouse model really within the development. So there's sort of a rule that you can see there of the window proportions and relationships. So if you go to the next one, we start to jump up to quite a different scale. So this is a project in Zelterstrasse in Berlin where there's a bit of a hybrid. So on the right, you've got some townhouses, those sort of 2-story townhouses you can see there. On the left are actually 4-story townhouses. So I'm looking at that middle image, sorry. So this one here. So these are 4-story townhouses with home offices on the ground floor. And then this level here, if you go in behind that level, is actually the garden level. So the car park is not underground because they couldn't afford it. They put the garage at ground floor and then actually brought up the garden level to level 1, which is quite interesting. So this sort of 3-story townhouse here, and then this apartment block here, we're able to share a courtyard that's quite protected within the centre of the city block, which is quite an interesting one. But what they did in this project is that instead of having any customisation at all from the residents, they designed of the 44 apartments something like 12 different dwelling arrangements. So there was lots of flexibility so people could choose the one that best matched their needs rather than customising one of the dwellings, which I think is an interesting model, particularly if you've got, say, a third of the people involved now and a further 2/3 to come in. You might have great, very strong ideas about what you want to deliver in your own homes, but maybe you could extrapolate that to create a bit of a mix for the future dwellings that people might take on at a later point in time. So if you keep going, So I think the architect was quite bullish about this project, saying, well, people just want a housing at cost. They don't want to design their own spaces. So we just gave them the choices. But I think it's, there's lots of different models within that. This is a fantastic model in Hamburg, which I visited back in actually 2016, so quite a few years ago now, where they went for a very severe efficiency. So they went I think it's personally very beautiful, but I think to an Australian aesthetic, it reeks of social democracy. But it's very interesting in that the efficiency of the best windows they could get, the best insulation and systems within that. So, but of course you get a very repetitive building. But the one sort of allowance to diversity is that within this kind of form, the parking is dealt with as a way that generates apartments above. So while you've got townhouse, sort of each townhouse has sort of the 3 windows to each home, you then see how the corner one, where all the parking for the row is dealt with, becomes a block that has a series of stacked apartments. And what that gives you is townhouses are very attractive, but they're completely useless for aging in place. So a sort of pancaked apartment that's lifted or has access to a lift can be quite an attractive model if you perhaps have some older residents or people who are more conscious of a next stage in their life. So an interesting model that says, we can provide diversity of living arrangements, even though perhaps the architecture is going to be very consistent and very severe. They also had a very particular view that they would let the garden do the identity. So this has a spectacular, if anyone who's into meadow landscapes or rewilding or peat or doof or any of this sort of thing, this landscape was a winner of a National Garden Award in Germany for having this really beautiful life of each house contributing to their garden over time. So a bit of a different focus. And I guess one of the biggest lessons for me is that the projects that are most successful that I visited, whether new or old, they're never complete. It isn't this perfectly neat, off the plan kind of marketing package render that stops and everyone lives happily thereafter. They leave spaces to evolve. They leave a bit of grass where you might be able to build a shed later on that does something you haven't thought of, or so on the left, we have Spreefeld in Berlin, where the land was left as decontaminated dirt, and they completely left everything. They then had a sinking fund in the budget, which they allocated to the garden committee, who were able to evolve it over time. And then there was a fence committee to choose that fence, which you probably don't want to think about such things at this point in time. But the one in the middle is really extraordinary, also in Hamburg, where there's a 19th century neighbourhood where no one has private space. And so each group is required to negotiate and agree about how their collective space within this laneway environment is used. And you see all sorts of extraordinary examples of how people's choices then influence that environment. And then on the right, a really interesting example, I think perhaps a good density reference for some parts of Canberra, is a project called Geworteld Wonen, which means rooted living. And this was a co-housing community in the Netherlands who were passionate about growing vegetables. And they were very interested in how this landscape might evolve. So they built the houses in a ring, quite dense homes around a large open area, and again left it as dirt and grass, and then each year it grows richer and richer with time. So even when we were visiting, they just installed this play equipment and what am I trying to say? I want to call it a jumping mat. I don't know what that is, but but I think this is really important. This idea that it's good to have a landscape concept and to have an idea of how things might be used. But I think leave enough looseness in a project that it can evolve. And I think that has implications for site selection if that is important for you, which I'll talk about in a moment with some other slides. I think I also wanted to just nerd out a little bit. I'm quite passionate personally about post-war modernism in Canberra, and have sort of written a very comprehensive list for myself about a year ago of the era of the Michael Dysarts and the Tom Uren and Durd and this kind of generation, and some before that as well, of sort of experimental housing. And so, from Urambi Village to projects like Roy Grounds Homes, and Harry Seidler's, and a whole range of these are quite beautiful projects. If you go to the next slide, if you aren't familiar with these projects, it's definitely well worth the visit. They're in, Griffith, Campbell, Swinger Hill, and other places like that. So here I've got Roy Grounds top left, Harry Seidler top right, John Andrews up the top and down the left, Swinger Hill as well. And then just a sort of more recent example, I think, by Stewart Architecture, who have done a number of things in Canberra over the years of quite a lovely, quite sustainable townhouse development that's a little bit of an interesting hybrid of apartments and townhouses. So I think it's, while as a city you certainly have a lower share of multi-residential, and I've been tracking your multi-residential awards for some year, and the pickings have been quite slim, as has been noted already. But I think there's some great history to look back to this kind of radical era of housing construction that could be thought about, particularly in this era of kind of what I call low-rise, high-density housing, which is a really rich sort of fertile ground in your city. I guess I just didn't want to be too Eurocentric, and good to think about what can grow in your own backyard or what already has.
Hey Andy, Design Canberra just finished on Sunday, but yeah, it's a yearly festival in Canberra, and they always do architecture tours and so on. So if people are interested, unfortunately it's just finished, but yeah, next November.
I've been in contact with them, and I've had a whinge to them that they don't have a sufficient focus on medium density. But yeah, I mean, there's some incredible. I've just forgotten the one fella who's the complete authority on everything modernism in Canberra. Is it Bill or something like that? Who I've been in contact with, but it's certainly for single houses. There's a great legacy and lots of incredible projects to visit. But I think that maybe the multi-res is not quite so well documented. I don't know if you'd agree, Phil.
You're probably right. Yeah, maybe next year's Design Canberra have that focus.
Sounds good.
Now I'm just conscious of time. We've got about a quarter of an hour till 7 o'clock, and we've got a couple of case studies to go through. If people are happy to go maybe a 7:15, I mean, I'm happy to also stick around, obviously, and we can try and finish off this next session in 10 minutes and sort of have 20 minutes of questions, or we can just kind of go straight to questions if people want to finish 7 on the dot. I'm not sure. I'll put it out to everybody. Well, maybe then I'll take silence as everybody's prepared to stick on till 7:15. So
Tim, I was just something to clarify, just to wrap up my section, is there was a comment about what we obviously had a list of skills within property collectives, but we do not offer architectural services. So I'm not presenting these images to you with any interest in an architectural commission. What I do with Tim is help in the briefing and selection of the architect as well as framing the urban design. So I think we'd be very keen to sort of select, work with yourselves to find a suitable local architect that would be best fit. I just thought it'd be good to clarify that.
Andy is an architect. He's not actively practicing as an architect in this sort of scale of space. Yeah. So look, I'll try and race through these case studies. I've got 2 case studies to just take people through very quickly. So this one is in West Brunswick, and it's adjacent to the Westwick Eco Village. I've got this here because it's our biggest project at 10 dwellings, but it's also, apart from our first project, it's the other truly sort of intentional community project that we've done of the 9. And so I thought maybe that was interesting for people. So the lot that we purchased is the lot in the top right-hand corner, sort of surrounded by the white banding. The blue section was stage 1 of Westwick, which was an eco village that I think was awarded the first One Planet Living accreditation in Australia back in maybe the late 90s, mid-late 90s, and stage 2 is planned, but has sort of stalled. And we have one member of this collective who's currently living in Canberra, and that's Chris. But at the moment, we have 8 members of this joint venture, and we're building 10 apartments. This is sort of a render of the proposed scheme. We're at the town planning process at the moment. We've got council support, and we're looking to start constructing this project sort of probably the 3rd quarter of next year. Now, landscaping has been really central to the design of this project. So two things have been critical, I suppose. One has been a desire of the group to have minimal car parking. So we've ended up with only 6 car parks for 10 dwellings, which is a significant reduction on what the statutory planning requirement is. And the other really key feature was this desire for the group to have a significant communal open space. So you'll see that the central band of the site is taken up by a large 215 square metre communal garden. Now, the dwellings have been designed to be highly efficient, and we've achieved 8.2 stars NAFAS ratings on average for all of the dwellings. So they have been designed with passive house kind of principles in mind. I suppose one of the reasons, and we'll touch on it in the next case study, that the group decided to focus on this communal open space was that the scale of this project at 10 dwellings meant that it really couldn't afford significant internal shared spaces, which is, I know, a hallmark of many, most co-housing projects sort of globally. These are the sort of floor plans. It's only a 2-storey building, which makes things fairly simple from a building code perspective as well. And all the apartments are quite generous. So they've been designed for the specific requirements of the group, but you'll see that they've also been designed with economies of scale in mind. So the floor plans are all very consistent and quite efficient. These are some inspiration images around sort of the exterior finishes. And this slide sort of shows graphically the 10 dwellings and what the different cost and value stack is for each of the dwellings. So we've got some small 2-bedrooms, some large 2-bedrooms, some small 3-bedrooms, and larger 3-bedrooms dwellings across the site. The bars there are the total costs. So you see the cheapest dwelling is 700,000 and the most expensive is a touch over $1 million. A touch over 1.1 million. The red section is what the debt is, so what the takeout mortgages are. So you see the smallest mortgage will be 467,000 and the largest 733. And then the orange is the equity capital contribution. So the smallest contribution again, 235,000, and the largest contribution, 367,000. And the lines represent obviously the total costs. The red line is the total cost. The orange line is what we forecast them to be worth midway through last year. And the blue line is what we forecast them to be worth at completion. So you can see that delta is obviously the developer profit, which is being internalised to all of the participants. In the next case study,
just quickly, Tim, did you explain earlier, I'm not sure if I missed it, why that delta is important for bank finance?
I didn't go into it in too much detail, but we do target this 15% return on cost or profit margin for all of our projects, because we know that when we go for construction funding, the bank will want to see a profitable project. So we want to put the project in the best position possible to get the best funding deal possible. So the most amount of debt at the cheapest amount. Because for most participants, that's a really critical factor. Equity capital is the hardest to come by. So we're trying to set the project up for success to enable the best funding deal possible. That's really the rationale.
And I guess that for the banks, the rationale is they fund a project on the assumption of failure, essentially, right? So they want to know that if the project goes belly up and they take carriage of it, that they're able to, proceed to an orderly sale and take a profit for their effort. So the profit that Tim speaks of, 15%, is theoretical. You never have to make that profit. You're not being forced to, but it's an important ceiling, because if you're, it requires a careful game of benchmarking local area values, because if you build a project that's super sustainable and ambitious and has very high costs as a result of that, it can be very hard to benchmark it in the local area to determine what its resale would be and therefore what that theoretical profit is. So it's a really important point. I think that took me a while to get my head around too, actually. So yeah, it's useful to talk about.
Thanks for the prompt. So this next case study is for a project that we're looking to acquire. We haven't acquired it yet, and it's in Belfield. It's part of a master plan divestment from the local council in Melbourne called Banyule City Council, and we've been on a bit of a journey, but we're looking at purchasing around an 1,850 square metre lot in the southwestern corner of this site, sort of indicated by that red circle there. The scheme we've come up with is a L-shaped scheme with a mix of apartments and townhouses. And so you'll see on the left there, that section in red with the 4, there is a 4-storey apartment building, and the section in with the 2 over it in orange is predominantly 2-storey townhouse section. The plans have evolved a little bit on from this when Andy did this landscaping concept.
I was going to say quickly, Tim, if you pop back to the previous slide, what you mentioned earlier, that important point about site acquisition, and I think it's important to note this group started on another site to the right-hand side of where that red circle is. And so actually through the first kind of feasibility phase, it became clear that the site we all had our heart set on actually wasn't the correct site at all. So we were fortunately, because of these site circumstances, we were able to relocate to another corner where we could actually get a much better outcome. So I think it's a really good example of that.
Yeah. Now, the diagram on the right, I think, is quite important too, and Andy might want to talk to it. But it's sort of outlining the different landscaping zones, but also in purple, we have sort of the communal zones denoted as well around this project. Now, we started off looking at 20 dwellings for this project. We've now looking at 35 dwellings with a mix of 8 townhouses and then the balance as apartments. Now, at that scale, at the 20 dwellings, it was somewhat a marginal project in terms of hitting that minimum 15% threshold, but we did have a sort of a 70 square metre communal room. As we've moved to 35 dwellings, it's become a more financially sustainable project, I think, which is good for all of the future participants. But it's also meant that that communal room has been able to grow slightly, and it's more sustainable for the project to deliver more internal communal spaces than the Victoria Street project, where it really couldn't afford any you know, and the shared spaces were really limited to garden areas only. The scheme in plan, and I won't go through it in too much detail, but I suppose one of the key things that's very exciting about this is that communal green, which is sort of facing north. And, you know, the configuration of this plan means that, you know, that central green is really well located for everyone to enjoy the benefit of.
Yep.
And that's that landscape plan again, in a bit more detail that we just sort of went through.
I think a very rough landscape concept is a better description. But I think one of the things we were talking about a lot with this site, it's got quite exposed streets on two sides and a sort of laneway that's quite protected, that's north and east, which in Melbourne is pretty optimal. But I think what was really interesting is the different zones of landscaping. We learnt a lot from a lot of local examples, particularly the paddock in Castlemaine was one that was a key reference for us in terms of the design of that interface of community and public. So we're interested in people having quite a few different choices. So, for example, that sort of fluffy green in the northwest corner was an area that was to be full sort of habitat essentially. So it's about dense planting, screening in the car parking, and maybe having, you know, zones for birds and insects and other things. Whereas this area might be more of a sort of event space, more of a gravel scape with clean trunk trees. And then this area for the community to the north might be more veggie patches with some outdoor seating. So I think not just thinking of a garden as one thing, but actually, you know, planning your garden as many rooms that have different functions, I think was something we were quite interested in. But in terms of this slide, I think this idea around the scale and the relationship to sort of indoor and outdoor space became really important. So I think on the left, we've got a project where essentially, you know, all of this zone, all of this zone is essentially spoken for on private title, and all of this zone is on private title. The two things that are communal are the car park. The car park comes from sort of having a laneway along the side where you could very efficiently stack the parking without having any circulation space. So, you know, normally when you've got a car park, you've got all these turning aisles and driveways. You know, even in this one here, you can see this sort of driveway. But actually, you know, in this case, you absolutely have the minimum parking, which allows you to build over the top of that. But by having the communal open space on this site, it doesn't cost you anything. It's not floor area that has to be built. And so you sort of get it for free. And if you want to leave it as dirt and then evolve it later as costs per metre or whatever you might do, you have that flexibility. I think the interesting thing with the project on the right is the group that were interested in that group were very much schooled in European co-housing, where there's a very, perhaps I would say, a dogmatic view of what should be provided on in a co-housing group. And a space like this, shared between 20 apartments, is a lot of additional cost per dwelling. So it's quite a significant amount until you get to a kind of critical mass of, you know, perhaps 25 or 30 dwellings, that things like that start to become viable. Whereas because of the nature of this site, which had setback obligations from council around here and here, and we really couldn't use this space for built form because we just couldn't make apartments that deep or didn't want to. So these inadvertent leftover spaces actually became incredibly valuable for the landscape amenity of the project. So I think the lesson from these two projects in particular is around site selection, where there might be a strange easement or a flood requirement or something odd that forces you not to build somewhere. What that can do is devalue that part of the site for another developer, but actually give you great opportunity for outdoor space that kind of costs you nothing. So I think that's a really interesting lesson about indoor and outdoor space and that kind of cost distribution. And then the final slide I whipped up because I thought it was something we talk about a lot. So again, excuse the fast little drawings, but just to explain some of the kind of key factors, I guess, with any project. So with the project scale of 4 townhouses in Northcote, you know, they have the ability to trade off individual car parking. So they could put their car parks, so still 4 car spaces, right, Tim? So four homes, 4 car spaces, but normally what that would mean is a I call a car hole ploughed into the front of every home, which means you don't get any ground floor usable floor space. Whereas by putting all the parking on the side, they were able to get fantastic townhouses that had ground floor access, was really fantastic, but could never have afforded a communal rooftop or a communal indoor space. Whereas the building on the top, you can imagine with sort of 30 apartments in an apartment building, all of a sudden a ground floor communal space could be really powerful. Viable and really valuable. So just understanding that there are these thresholds where certain things can become possible that might determine how you think as a community. And equally on the communal space, that idea of, the ground kind of, ground doesn't cost nothing. Of course, you pay for land, but landscaping does not require, the level of cost that an indoor space provides. So finding opportunities to have well-oriented, well-located open space that can be part of that community hub, and maybe you can build structures in it later, can be really attractive. Maybe you can build a Venlo greenhouse or a shed or something simple that you can kind of adapt and evolve over time, whereas the indoor space will typically carry the same costs as the apartment per square metre, possibly more depending on the requirements for kitchens and bathrooms and other things like that. And then I guess that final point about parking, and I've undersold it here because, a typical indoor car park actually usually ends up being more like 30 square metres per car park because of that requirement for circulation and access. But 14.7 square metres is a fairly typical hotel room in a 5-star hotel. So to put that in perspective, you can sort of see what you're trading off. If for example, you might choose that rather than building your parking in the building, you could park on an adaptable courtyard gravel landscape that could do many things. I think, let's be real about the Canberra context. There is a need for at least access to a shared car, if not private vehicle access, but you can still be incredibly clever with how you position parking within a development to make it sociable, successful, and flexible. And I often talk about parking in the sense of, we often talk about adaptability for autonomous vehicles and in 2030, this and that. But my test is, can you adapt it on Saturday night? Because at the end of the day, if you want to pull the cars out and have a party or have an event or have a piano recital, and I say that because a friend of mine's apartment building, which I can actually see from here, his basement has piano recitals and food and wine festival events in the basement. So I think thinking about these things flexibly rather than just thinking about the car, and understanding that cars cost in floor space as well as, just their day-to-day costs. I think it's just important to think about these 3 things. For Tim and I, we really felt are the kind of key project drivers.
Well, I'm conscious of time. It's 7:07. So so I suppose apologies for running over time and not having more time for questions. But maybe anybody wants to raise any questions. We've got 10 minutes.
There was Julie's earlier question about the licensing the property collectives model versus. Did you see that one? That's the third one.
Is it possible to buy your model if there's already a group of builders, designers, planners? Look, it's a good question. I think we're pretty flexible about how we can work with people. I think for areas where we're not physically, obviously an active project management sort of role doesn't necessarily make sense. And we're taking that approach with the Byron Bay project, where really it's more of an advisory role. So yeah, I think it's very possible. I mean, we haven't actually done a project interstate yet. So it probably pays to be quite flexible about your approach. But practically, I think, having a sort of like a full service management approach doesn't necessarily make sense interstate.
Would it be fair to say though, it's not something so neat as to be packaged up and sent to you via your browser to click on? It's probably more about the time and the advisory work. The kind of, almost maybe a coaching role is probably a good way to think about it.
I think it would be more sort of like a coaching approach, rather than sort of packaging it up in a box and, you know, sending it over the fence for $39.95.
Yeah, there's another one about the long-term investors and owners, or what are investors looking for in a project, from Cal?
I think most of the investors are really understanding that, you know, investing in a good location and investing in a home of a good owner-occupier quality is a smart investment, you know. I think that's probably the overriding driver.
But they would be renting it out, and they would be
maintaining it, maintaining completion, and renting it out. Yeah.
One of the interesting ones I remember, Tim, I don't know which project this was or if it's still relevant, but maybe Ireland, where someone was looking to buy, who didn't live in Melbourne, but they wanted their children when they grew up to go to Melbourne Uni or something like that. And so is that right? Am I getting that mixed up? So someone was buying it to rent now, but with a view that their kids would move in later.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And there is a bit of that. We have a number of participants who are doing their kids, because they sort of think, oh, how's my kid ever going to get into the market? So, I mean, it's that kind of mentality. Yeah. A question from Anne. What percentage of your Melbourne projects is the land? I mean, percent of cost. Okay. That's a good question. So, for instance, the Clark Street project, we had a total cost of a bit over $1 million for each dwelling. So it was sort of a circa $7.5 million cost to deliver those that project. We bought the land for $2.24 million. So you can work out the ratio there. Similarly, for the Straddle Street project in Thornbury, that was 6 townhouses at about a $6.3 million total project cost, and we bought that land for $1.9 million. So that's a couple of examples.
Tim, I've got a couple of others that I've extrapolated because I was curious out of some of your feasibility. So Westwick, 30% land, 2% land purchase costs, 3% land holding costs. So that's 35% land related. And Otter Street is 28% land and acquisition, which didn't proceed, but and 1% holding costs on that. So 30% roughly.
Yep, that sounds about right. 1/3 for the land and 2/3 to deliver the project. So there's a question from, sorry, let me just, from Patch.
The exit one, yeah.
How do you facilitate people to exit a project if the circumstances change? That's a very good question. So people can transfer their interest. It is an instrument that can be transferred. We sort of have a 3-step process for transferring an interest. Well, the first 4 steps actually. The first one is to value what that interest is at that point in time. But then in terms of transferring it, firstly, we offer it to everybody who is in the group to take over proportionally first. And if that doesn't happen, then individuals within the group can take it over, because it's probably easiest to deal with it from within the group. But if that doesn't happen, we then go outside the group and find an external party to purchase that interest. And ultimately, if it is an external party, then all the members of the collective need to agree that they're comfortable with that external party coming in and taking over the interest.
You've normally said, Tim, that as the project gets closer to realisation, it becomes easier to fill those spots too, because people don't have to endure the same length and have more certainty. Is that right, as a rule of thumb?
Yeah, I mean, look, development is the process of going from grey to black and white. So all things that I think most people prefer more certainty than less. So yeah, as you get closer to the end, it is it's easier to provide people with certainty. So it's probably easier for people to come on board. Yeah.
I might put this up really quickly. I don't know if you're happy just to show this, Tim. This is just from a project to get a really quick sense of the split very crudely. So land and acquisition, you can see here. Can you read this, or is that blurry? So 28% land, 6% professional fees, 47% construction, other fees and services, holding costs. And then there's the profit component, which obviously you then, in this case, 17%, but you would internalise. That's a good, that was my way of getting my head around a much more complicated looking feasibility of that project. So hopefully that helps others. There's a question about environmental protection context. For sale, 1.6 million. That's very specific. I mean, the most famous one, I guess, that I know of is Bend of Islands in Melbourne, which is a very, very famous cooperative, but extremely low land value, and they wrote their own planning controls to make it happen. I think the thing that we've found, we've had a number of approaches from an area called Nillumbik, which is sort of northeast of Melbourne, maybe an hour away, very beautiful, very strong art scene. I don't know if any of you have heard of Montsalvat or Eltham, that kind of way. And what typically happens is the planning provisions that stop sprawl, which is a good thing, also prevent multiple occupancy on rural land. So we very much find that those kind of typologies on rural properties are quite limited because of the, what they might unleash in other forms. There are clever ways of getting around that, like doing a cooperative house, like the mothership with pods, and there's all sorts of tricks in the building code around exploded additions and contiguous construction and all sorts of things like that. But that's a mess from a liquidity perspective and from a funding perspective, because from a bank perspective, it's one entity, it's extremely risky. You don't have any ability to sort of buy in or out. So the title is the key thing on large rural lots that makes it difficult. If you forego the title, then possibilities arise, but I don't know enough about the ACT planning context, so someone else might have a better sense of that than me. I know there's a lot of them in northern New South Wales, but most of them are legacy and pretty hard to do now. It's an urban lot in Lake Macquarie. Oh, wow.
I think Suzanne, to answer your question, how is there a formula for how many households are needed to make it viable? You have to do a feasibility study. I think that's the only answer.
The formula is proportionate to the size, the capacity, and the value of the land. Really, there are sites in Melbourne where 3 townhouses would be viable, and there are sites where you couldn't build less than 15. It just really depends on where you are and what would be possible. There are also, you do find there are dead zones in cities where certain areas are just so exorbitantly high for single homes that it can make it very difficult and you can be outcompeted, or vice versa. If you're in an urban context, you get outcompeted by much more aggressive development that want to overbuild the site. So that's why finding like Tim's sweet spot of this distance around the city and this low rise, high density scale of kind of sub 4 stories, 2 to 4 stories really has been a market gap where there's a relatively unsophisticated development sector of plot by plot developers, small builder developers. When you jump into 4 or 5 story and above kind of heavyweight concrete construction, you get increasingly sophisticated players who can pay more for sites. So these little niches are quite important.
They are. Yeah, absolutely. Okay. Well, it's nearly 20 past. Are you waving? You want to ask another question, Julia, or are you saying goodbye?
Saying goodbye.
Saying goodbye. Okay. All right. Well, thanks, guys. Appreciate the time. And
Thank you so much.
That's okay. Yeah. Feel free to get in touch if yeah, want to talk some more. Okay.
I'll be in Canberra on Boxing Day for a few days. So if anyone wants to catch up for a beer, let me know.
Thanks, Thor, for the invitation, and thanks everybody for attending.
Thanks, guys. And yeah, Andy, I'm up for a beer on Boxing Day.
I'm gonna go check out some Michael Darsart projects with me.
We're going on a bike ride.
Sounds great.
Me too.
I'll actually have my road bike with me. All right. See you, everyone.